I want you to start by imagining the absolute most devastating weapon of the modern era. Just close your eyes for a second, wherever you are, and picture it.
Most people are probably picturing something nuclear, right?
Exactly. You are almost certainly picturing something radioactive, something glowing, insanely complex, housed in some underground silo requiring dual key launch codes and, I don't know, intricate, highly unstable chemistry.
Right.
Well, I need you to take that entire image and just throw it completely away. The ultimate weapon of our current year, 2026, isn't radioactive. It doesn't glow. And it's actually shockingly simple. It is, for all intents and purposes, just a very heavy rock dropped from a very, very high place.
It really represents the oldest concept in the history of human conflict. I mean, throwing a heavy object at your enemy. But here, it's scaled up to the unforgiving laws of orbital mechanics. And by doing so, it changes absolutely everything about how we understand global security, deterrence, and, well, the future of warfare itself.
The timing of this deep dive could not be more critical. Let's establish exactly where we are right now. Today's Sunday, March 8, 2026. And just 1 month ago, a massive shift in the architecture of global security occurred. A shift that makes the topic we are exploring today urgently, terrifyingly relevant to the world you are walking around in right now.
The invisible frameworks that have kept the sky relatively safe for over half a century are fundamentally unraveling. Treaties have expired, technology has advanced, and the economic barriers that, once kept science fiction concepts strictly out of reality, they've completely collapsed.
And to understand exactly how and why that is happening, we are diving into a truly fascinating, deeply unsettling geopolitical and strategic essay from this year. It is titled Rods from God: Kinetic Bombardment, the Death of Arms Control, and the Architecture of the Unconstrained Sky.
It's a heavy title for a heavy subject.
Yeah, it really is. Our mission for today is to unpack this text completely. We are going to explore how a powdered drink mix from the 1920s, a science fiction concept from the 1960s, and the very recent total collapse of commercial space launch costs have all converged.
Converged to create an unstoppable, treaty-breaking weapon, one that is quite possibly hovering right over our heads as we speak.
It is a profound document. The author takes us on this conceptual journey from the flat, quiet plains of the American Midwest to the furthest, coldest reaches of low Earth orbit. It connects historical military logistics with hypersonic physics.
And it explains not just what this weapon is, but why the specific geopolitical and economic conditions for its existence have suddenly ripened right now, in 2026. But I think it's important to set the stage for you, the listener, regarding how we are approaching this material today.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's make that clear.
The essay we're looking at takes a purely clinical look at global events. It isn't taking sides. Whether it's discussing United States military strikes, Russian orbital maneuvers, or Iranian underground bunkers, it is strictly analyzing the cold, hard math of modern strategic engineering.
That's a vital distinction. We're here to impartially report the geopolitical analysis exactly as the source text presents it. We aren't endorsing any state's actions or political viewpoints. We're just exploring the terrifying brilliance of the ideas contained in the original source material.
Precisely. We're looking at the mechanics of the situation.
Right. So let's start in what might seem like the most unlikely place imaginable for a story about futuristic space weapons. I want you to picture the town you grew up in. Or maybe just picture a quiet, flat, inland town. We are going to Hastings, Nebraska.
Hastings, right on the high plains.
Exactly. It sits essentially at the exact geographic center of the continental United States. It's perfectly equidistant from the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. The wind just howls across the prairie. Now, in 1927, an inventor named Edwin Perkins was working in his kitchen on West 1st Street in Hastings.
Working on a liquid concentrate, right.
Yeah, he reformulated a liquid concentrate he'd been selling and produced a powdered drink mix. He called it Kool-Aid. That's Kool-Aid with an ADE, the original spelling.
It seems like a trivial piece of Americana to open a military analysis with, but the essay uses Edwin Perkins' kitchen experiment to introduce a really foundational strategic concept. Think about the logistical nightmare of shipping a liquid.
No, it's awful. It's heavy, it requires glass bottles that break, and you're mostly just paying to ship water.
Exactly. The brilliance of Kool-Aid was its simplicity. Perkins found a way to take enormous potential flavor, sweetness, color, and dehydrate it. He concentrated it into the most deliverable form possible, which is a dry powder.
You ship the lightweight powder, you mix it with water at the final destination, and you just let basic chemistry do the rest of the work.
The text points out that Hastings understood this profound logic of concentration long before the military had a formal doctrinal name for it. The core philosophy is just concentrate potential, store it easily, and release it effortlessly.
Okay, let's unpack this because we have to fast forward exactly 15 years from that kitchen experiment. It's 1942. The world is engulfed in the Second World War, and the United States government looks at a map. They choose that exact same Nebraska prairie for a very different kind of concentration,
They built the Naval Ammunition Depot, the NAD.
just southeast of Hastings, and the scale of this undertaking is just mind-blowing. We are talking about 49,000 acres of flat, concealed inland terrain. At its peak, this single facility produced and stored over 40% of the entire United States Navy's munitions.
40%.
Almost half the explosive power of the greatest naval force on Earth sitting out in a cornfield.
The statistics become even more staggering when you consider the physical footprint on that specific location. Over 2,000 buildings were constructed on that prairie grass. This included hundreds of heavily reinforced concrete, igloo-style storage magazines designed to hold massive quantities of high explosives.
And the trains, right?
Yeah, the military laid down 207 miles of private railroad track. That's a network larger than many small countries' entire rail systems. And it was built just to move bombs, torpedoes, and 40-millimeter shells 24 hours a day. At its absolute peak, the facility required a workforce of over 10,000 people operating around the clock.
They basically built a hidden explosive metropolis in the middle of nowhere, which brings up the obvious question. Why there? I mean, if you were supplying ships in the Pacific and ships in the Atlantic, why not build this massive explosive factory on the coast where the ships actually are? Why drag 40% of the Navy's bombs out to Nebraska?
The author calls this the strategy of the prairie, and it relies on three specific pillars. First, inland placement provided absolute safety from any coastal bombardment. An enemy fleet simply could not reach Nebraska.
Right, way out of range.
Second, being geographically central meant rapid, equidistant distribution. You could send trains east or west with equal efficiency. But the third reason is the most crucial for our eventual understanding of orbital weapons.
Invisibility.
Invisibility. The sheer emptiness of the Great Plains provided a profound psychological defense. The defense was the assumption by the enemy that absolutely nothing of consequence happens in the middle of the American country. Hastings was chosen specifically because nobody was looking at it.
You hide the thunder in plain sight. But the danger of concentrating that much potential energy is always there, waiting for a spark. And in September of 1944, that danger became brutally apparent. A catastrophic explosion tore through the depot. 9 men were killed instantly.
It was a massive event.
The blast was so violent it opened a crater in the Nebraska earth that was 500 feet wide. Just picture a hole in the ground the size of 1.5 football fields. And the shockwave was so massive it was felt 100 miles away in the city of Lincoln.
But despite that terrifying, unintended release of energy, the depot just kept going. The military essentially put the thunder back to sleep under the grass, and America went right on making war.
And that infrastructure, remarkably, hasn't vanished into history. The text notes that those original concrete igloos still stand today. They are located at a site literally called Bunker Hill in Adams County, Nebraska.
Right. The Nebraska Army National Guard still operates the Greenleaf training site there. They conduct live fire and maneuver training on the exact terrain shaped by that original 1940s depot.
The ground under Hastings has been military ground for over 80 years. It is a permanent monument to the strategy of hidden concentration. Now, I can hear you wondering why this essay spends so much time on a Nebraska military base from the 1940s in a deep dive about futuristic space weapons.
It's all about the underlying logic.
Exactly. It's because the logic of Hastings is the exact same logic driving the ultimate weapon of 2026. The philosophy remains identical. Reduce an enormous amount of destructive potential to its absolute simplest, most concentrated, most deliverable form.
Put it somewhere vast, empty, where absolutely no one is looking.
And then when the time comes, let physics do the rest. The only difference is that today, the new prairie, the new invisible vast storage magazine, isn't the American Midwest, it's low Earth orbit.
The transition from the conceptual framing of Hastings to the terrifying reality of orbital mechanics brings us to the core subject of the essay. We're looking at a concept known in declassified military literature as hypervelocity rod bundles.
But the public, and indeed many in the defense community, refer to it by a much more visceral, terrifying moniker, the rods from God.
The history of this idea feels like it was ripped straight out of a Cold War thriller. It was first systematically developed under the name Project Thor, and the guy who proposed it was named Jerry Pournelle.
He was a scientist working at Boeing in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Interestingly, he also happened to be a famous science fiction author.
He was. He even co-wrote a highly acclaimed sci-fi novel in 1985 called Footfall. It actually featured aliens using this exact weapon against humanity.
But Pornell went to the Pentagon and pitched Project Thor not as science fiction, but as a credible, highly usable alternative to tactical nuclear weapons.
His argument to the Pentagon was undeniably elegant, in that chilling, clinical way that weapons of mass destruction sometimes are. Pornell realized a fundamental truth of physics. The kinetic energy released by a sufficiently massive object traveling at hypersonic velocity is functionally equivalent to the destructive output of a small nuclear warhead.
And this is the critical strategic distinction, it produces absolutely none of the radioactive fallout.
Exactly. It carries none of the international legal exposure associated with deploying nuclear arms and none of the political stigma. In modern strategic terms, Project Thor represented the holy grail of military planning, a clean weapon of mass destruction.
We should define clean here, because it certainly doesn't mean it sweeps the floors. It means you drop it, it destroys everything in a massive, localized radius. But you don't have to worry about poisoning the Earth for 10,000 years.
There are no glowing craters. There are no radioactive half-lives to track.
You don't have birth defects appearing in the civilian population for generations. The specific thing you want dead stays dead, and the land around it doesn't become a toxic exclusion zone.
Right.
But I want to look at the actual physical object we were talking about because it's almost absurdly basic. It's not a complex missile with fins and sensors. It is a solid cylinder of pure tungsten. The proposed design is a rod 20 feet long and 1 foot in diameter.
To put that in perspective for you, picture a standard telephone pole on the side of the road that is the exact size and shape.
But because it's solid metal, it weighs 24,000 pounds. That is 12,000 kilograms of pure mass.
And the choice of tungsten is paramount to the entire concept. It wasn't selected arbitrarily. If you look at the periodic table, tungsten is one of the densest, naturally occurring metals on our planet. It is approximately 1.7 times denser than lead.
Wow.
But density alone isn't enough. The critical factor is its thermal resilience. Tungsten has a melting point exceeding 6,100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Which is why it can survive the drop.
Precisely. This specific property is what makes dropping a telephone pole from space viable. When an object falls from orbit, it has to pass through the dense layers of the Earth's atmosphere. The aerodynamic friction generates unimaginable heat.
If you dropped a telephone pole made of solid steel, it would melt into slag before it ever reached the ground.
If you used titanium, it would ablate. The outer layers would literally peel and burn away under the thermal stress. But tungsten endures. It punches through the atmosphere and arrives at its target in essentially the exact same physical condition it left, the orbital platform.
But a rock is just a rock. How does dropping a piece of metal, no matter how heavy, equal the power of a nuclear bomb? The United States Air Force did a report back in 2003, part of their transformation flight plan, and they calculated what happens when a 20-foot tungsten telephone pole hits the Earth at Mach 10.
That's 10 times the speed of sound.
Their estimate was that it delivers kinetic energy equivalent to 11.5 tons of TNT. But how do we get to that massive number without a single drop of explosive chemical?
It comes down to the fundamental formula for kinetic energy, which is 1/2 times mass times velocity squared. The mass of the rod, the 24,000 pounds, is certainly significant, but think of velocity as a multiplier in that equation.
Okay.
If you double the weight of the object, you simply double the damage. But because the velocity is squared, if you double the speed, you multiply the damage by 4. At Mach 10, that velocity multiplier becomes an absolute monster. The speed generates a final output of kinetic energy that simply overwhelms any conventional defense, any structural shelter, and any expectation of human survival.
I'm looking at that number, though. 11.5 tons of TNT. We've built conventional bombs bigger than that. The MOA bad, the mother of all bombs, has a higher explosive yield. So why is the tungsten rod considered so much more devastating if the raw energy equivalence is technically lower?
Energy equivalence doesn't account for the geometry of the impact, and geometry is everything here. If you detonate a nuclear warhead or a massive conventional bomb like the MOAB, it distributes its energy as an expanding sphere.
It goes everywhere.
The overpressure, the heat, the shock wave, it all pushes outward in 360 degrees. A massive amount of that energy is essentially wasted, blowing up the empty air above the target. The tungsten rod, however, focuses all of that immense kinetic energy through a single point just 1 foot in diameter, traveling nose first straight down into the Earth.
It isn't functioning as a bomb, it's functioning as a drill.
That is the perfect analogy. And the modern iterations of this design solved the original engineering problems that Project Thor faced in the 1960s. The early limitation was targeting accuracy. There was a significant risk that the rod would tumble as it hit the dense lower atmosphere, burning up unevenly and missing its target,
The solution, which is detailed in the essay's framework, is spin stabilization.
meaning they don't just push it out of the satellite and let it fall.
They shoot it out of an electromagnetic railgun attached to the orbital platform.
Yes. The whale gun doesn't just push the rod, it spins it. By spinning the rod at several thousand revolutions per minute during its release, effectively rifling it in the vacuum of space, the rod acquires immense gyroscopic stability. It enters the atmosphere spinning exactly like a high-powered rifle bullet.
This guarantees it won't tumble.
It strikes perfectly nose first, preserving its aerodynamic profile and hitting the target at maximum possible velocity.
I want to paint a picture of the exact fraction of a second when this thing hits. What physically happens when a 24,000-pound spin-stabilized tungsten telephone pole strikes the ground at Mach 10? Does it just crack the concrete bunker in half?
The physics actually change states. At hypersonic speeds, the sheer kinetic energy overpowers the molecular bonds of the target material. A spinning projectile like this doesn't just shatter or crush the reinforced concrete.
It does something much weirder.
The combination of its extreme velocity, its rotational energy, and the compressive physics of the impact causes the material it hits, whether that's steel plate, military-grade concrete, or solid mountain granite, to behave as a fluid. The rod doesn't push the material aside, it converts it into a plasma state. The concrete literally liquefies ahead of the penetrator.
The idea of a solid, steel-reinforced underground bunker turning into a fluid is deeply terrifying. It doesn't break the roof, it flows right through it.
As the text perfectly describes the phenomenon, it flows through the bunker in the way that a hot nail flows through wax. The penetration depth achieved by a kinetic system like this extends hundreds of feet below the surface. It can reach subterranean command facilities and hardened underground structures that even the most advanced, rocket-assisted, Earth-penetrating bombs have historically failed to scratch.
This is the ultimate, definitive answer to the question that has haunted military planners since the dawn of the Cold War. What do you do about a bunker that is built too deep?
The answer is physics. You just make the thing going vertically down faster, heavier, and denser than the thing going horizontally sideways can possibly stop.
Now, before we get into why militaries around the world are practically salivating for this exact weapon right now, we need to take a quick step back. This deep dive relies on an essay that details recent, highly specific geopolitical alliance. It names the United States, Russia, China, and Iran.
It is crucial to reiterate our role here. We are examining the timeline and the strategic calculus exactly as the source text lays them out. The essay uses these specific nations to illustrate the limits of current military technology. We are looking at this strictly through the lens of engineering and physics.
We are not endorsing the foreign policy or military actions of any state mentioned.
Absolutely not. Impartial reporting of the text.
With that firm clinical perspective in mind, let's look at the strategic panic driving the desire for this weapon today. The essay points to a very specific event from just last year, June of 2025, Operation Midnight Hammer.
This was the 12-day war.
The text details a United States strike on Iran's Fordo uranium enrichment plant. Now, Fordo is an absolute nightmare target for an Air Force. It isn't just a building on a flat plain. It is carved deep into the side of a mountain, buried approximately 80 to 90 meters underground, southeast of Tehran.
To attempt to neutralize this facility, the United States deployed 7 of its B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. They dropped 14 of the most powerful conventional bunker-busting weapons currently in their arsenal. The GBU-57AB Massive Ordnance Penetrator, commonly known as the MOP.
Each one of these guided munitions weighs 30,000 pounds. The attack, as documented in the essay, was technically successful. 12 bombs fell in a highly coordinated sequence on the facility's 2 primary ventilation shafts.
The first bomb removed the protective concrete cap, and the subsequent bombs traveled rapidly down the open shafts, moving at over 1,000 feet per second into the underground enrichment halls before detonating. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, later confirmed serious structural damage to the underground cascade halls.
That sounds like a massive success for conventional bunker-busting bombs. So what does this all mean? Why is this event considered the catalyst for needing a space weapon?
The massive but that the essay highlights is the preparation time. The United States was only able to pull this off because they had spent 15 entire years studying the blueprints of Fordo. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency had dedicated officers analyzing every single detail of that facility for a decade and a half.
They knew the precise GPS coordinates of the ventilation shafts.
Right. The attack succeeded strictly because it perfectly threaded the needle down those existing shafts. It did not succeed because the bomb itself could punch through 80 meters of solid mountain rock.
And this reveals the critical, terrifying limitation of current arsenals. The MOP, despite weighing 30,000 pounds and being packed with advanced explosives, maxes out at a penetration depth of about 200 feet. That's roughly 61 meters through dense rock or reinforced concrete.
But Fordo is 80 to 90 meters deep. The math simply doesn't align. If you don't have perfect intelligence, or if you can't thread the needle down an exposed ventilation shaft, you simply cannot destroy the facility with explosive chemistry.
Which brings us to the outright panic outlined in the text. The essay cites satellite imagery from February 2026, just a month ago in our timeline, showing a site called Pickaxe Mountain, located next to the Natanz facility in Iran.
The intelligence shows active, massive hardening of tunnel entrances. Fresh concrete pours are visible from space. Excavation trucks are everywhere, and they are building at depths of up to 100 meters.
The strategic implication is incredibly clear. They watched Operation Midnight Hammer, they calculated the exact limits of the 30,000-pound MOP, and they just started digging deeper than the bombs can reach.
This raises an urgent question for defense strategists, and it forms the crux of the current dilemma. The United States has exactly one type of aircraft capable of delivering the one type of bomb that maxes out at 61 meters. Meanwhile, adversaries are rapidly constructing vital facilities at 100 meters or more.
This means that explosive chemistry, the entire science of packing combustible material into a metal casing to create downward force, has reached its absolute physical limit.
You cannot make a conventional bomb bigger. The aircraft couldn't carry it, and the casing would shatter upon impact before penetrating.
So, if chemistry has failed, where do you turn? You have to abandon chemistry entirely. You have to pivot to pure physics. You have to pivot to a Mach 10 tungsten rod. Because the rod isn't constrained by how much explosive you can fit inside it. It's constrained only by its own density and its velocity. A kinetic impactor can go well past 100 meters.
It goes as deep as the liquefaction of the rock allows.
If the physics of kinetic bombardment are so irrefutably perfect, and the strategic need to destroy deep bunkers is so dire, the obvious question arises. Why wasn't this built during the Cold War? Why didn't Jerry Pournelle see his idea realized in the 1980s during the height of the Reagan Star Wars defense initiatives?
The answer is purely economic. The barrier was never conceptual. The barrier was the exorbitant price tag of overcoming Earth's gravity.
But wait, during the space shuttle era, putting anything in orbit cost a fortune. How could anyone afford to put 60 metric tons of solid metal up there? Let's do the fighter jet math, because the economics of orbit have completely shifted, and it's mind-blowing.
Let's rewind to that space shuttle era. Back then, it cost roughly $54,000 to put a single kilogram of mass into low Earth orbit. We established that one tungsten telephone pole weighs 12,000 kilograms. So under the space shuttle program, launching just one single rod would cost $648 million.
Or one rod.
Right. And a full orbital platform was proposed to carry 6 of these rods, plus the satellite bus itself, the targeting sensors, the power systems, and the electromagnetic railgun. That brings the total launch cost to somewhere between $4 and $5 billion for a single weapon.
Even for the Pentagon, whose pockets are famously deep, that was just absurdly prohibitive for a conventional weapon. Project Thor stayed on the sci-fi shelves because gravity was too expensive.
But then, the fundamental economics of space access collapsed in a way no one predicted. The text traces this transformation, starting with SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy rockets. This period burst what aerospace analysts began calling Musk's Law, the dramatic exponential reduction in launch costs driven by rapid reusability.
By landing and reusing the first stage booster, the cost per kilogram to low Earth orbit plummeted from $54,000 down to approximately $1,400. That is a 97% reduction in cost.
But the Falcon Heavy was merely the prologue to the current crisis.
Enter the Starship era, the years 2025 to 2026. We are now looking at a fully reusable, two-stage, heavy-lift vehicle that can deliver over 150 metric tons to low Earth orbit in a single routine flight. The cost hasn't just dropped, it has absolutely cratered.
At current operational parameters, we're looking at $78 to $94 per kilogram. With high reusability, flying these ships 20 times or more without major refurbishment projections fall to between $13 and $32 per kilogram, and the target is $10 per kilogram.
Let that number sit with you for a second. From $54,000 down to $10. That is a 5,400 time reduction in the cost of reaching space.
The implications of this economic collapse for orbital kinetic bombardment are absolute. We can now calculate the modern 2026 price tag for a rods from God platform. Launching the full payload, 6 10-ton tungsten rods, which equates to 60 metric tons of raw material, now costs somewhere between a mere $600,000 and $6 million using Starship.
And the tungsten itself, despite its exotic properties, is surprisingly cheap on the industrial market, trading at about $50 per kilogram. So the raw material cost for the 6 deadly rods is only $3 million.
So the ROS themselves and the shipping costs to get them to space are incredibly cheap.
What is the expensive part of the system now?
The cost is almost entirely localized in the delivery mechanism: the satellite bus, the spin-stabilized railgun launcher, and the power generation system. To operate an electromagnetic railgun in deep space reliably, you need continuous massive amounts of power to spin 24,000-pound rod.
Solar panels aren't going to cut it.
Solar panels are insufficient and vulnerable. That requires a nuclear battery, specifically a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, or RTG. This sophisticated military-grade platform, integrating the RTG in the railgun, costs approximately $200 million.
Okay, let's add that all up to see the final bill. Launch costs a maximum of $6 million. Tungsten material, $3 million. Platform and nuclear battery, $200 million. We are looking at a total cost of roughly $210 million to $250 million for a fully operational, permanently armed orbital kinetic strike platform.
Now let's put that number into modern military perspective. Let's look at the E-35 Lightning II second fighter jet, the backbone of modern Western air power.
The current flyaway cost of a single F-35 is about $83 million. That means this unstoppable orbital platform costs the exact same as just 2.5 F-35s.
And when you compare the vulnerabilities and operational limitations of the two systems, the comparison becomes genuinely arresting. Consider the F-35. Despite being a marvel of stealth engineering and sensor fusion, it operates in a highly contested environment.
It requires a highly trained human pilot whose life is constantly at risk. It requires highly volatile aviation fuel that limits its range. Its complex electronics can be subjected to sophisticated electronic warfare and jamming.
It can be grounded by severe weather or a simple mechanical failure on the runway. It operates in one atmosphere over one specific theater of war at one specific time.
And critically, despite its stealth, it can be shot down by advanced surface-to-air missiles. Defeating an F-35 is an entire global industry. Adversaries have spent billions of dollars explicitly to build radar and interceptors to kill it.
Now look at the tungsten rod hovering in orbit. There is no human pilot to capture or kill. There is no jet fuel to explode. There are no electronics on the rod itself to jam. Once it drops, it's just a dumb piece of metal.
It is completely immune to weather. A hurricane won't stop it.
And unlike an F-35 that has to fly hours from a base to reach the target, the orbital platform is already everywhere. It orbits the Earth every 90 minutes. It operates 247, hovering over every single theater of war simultaneously.
Furthermore, there is almost no warning signature at launch. Consider a traditional ballistic missile. When an ICBM launches, it produces a massive column of fire. Satellites equipped with infrared sensors detect that massive heat plume instantly, triggering early warning systems globally.
But the kinetic rod, because it launches in the freezing vacuum of orbit, it produces an infrared signature that is orders of magnitude smaller than a ballistic missile. Its radar cross-section during its hypersonic descent through the atmosphere is practically microscopic due to its slender shape.
By the time any ground-based air defense system detects the incoming threat, it is traveling at Mach 10 and is roughly 11 seconds away from impact. It is permanently positioned, unjammable, and practically undetectable until it is far too late to evacuate.
As the text so chillingly concludes, you are not comparing prices, you are comparing mortality.
I have to admit, comparing mortality is a line that gave me absolute chills when I read the source material. It strips away all the technological jargon and gets right to the terrifying truth.
It does.
Okay, so we have the physics perfected, we have the desperate strategic need to bust deep bunkers, and we have the newly affordable price tag thanks to commercial spaceflight. So what is stopping a country from just putting 50 of these up there tomorrow?
Well, that brings us to the law, or rather, the terrifying lack of it. Let's talk about the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. This is essentially the foundational constitution of space law.
It was signed during the absolute peak of the Cold War, right in the long shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Everyone was terrified of one specific thing: Soviet or American nuclear weapons orbiting over their heads. And the treaty did its job. Article 4 explicitly forbids placing nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in orbit.
It was a monumental achievement for its time. Currently, 118 nations are party to that treaty, and it explicitly states that the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. But treaties are written with the vocabulary, the fears, and the technological understanding of their era.
The Outer Space Treaty meticulously prohibits what the world of 1967 was afraid of. It says absolutely nothing about dropping a heavy metal rod.
This is where the legal maneuvering becomes fascinating and incredibly dangerous. The essay cites legal analysts from West Point's Lieber Institute. They looked at the text of the treaty, and they found a loophole so big you could drop a tungsten telephone pole straight through it.
A tungsten rod is just elemental metal. It has no biological agents. It has no chemical explosive compounds. It has absolutely no nuclear material.
Therefore, legally speaking, it cannot be classified as a weapon of mass destruction under the definitions used when the treaty was drafted.
Legally, the satellite's railgun is classified merely as a propulsion system, and the rod itself is classified just as a mass. The fact that this mass creates a 500-foot crater and liquefies a bunker is just an unfortunate byproduct of physics.
So under the strictest, most literal reading of international space law, deploying and dropping a kinetic rod from orbit is perfectly legal.
The Arms Control Association and other diplomatic bodies have argued that a broader, more holistic reading of the treaty's peaceful purposes language should inherently prohibit these kinetic weapons. But as the essay points out, that interpretation has never achieved binding legal status or international consensus.
And the United States, among other nations, has consistently declined to enter negotiations to draft new treaties that would explicitly extend prohibitions to conventional space weapons. But the legal void is not limited to the aging text of the Outer Space Treaty. The essay brings us to a much more immediate and frankly much more alarming date, February 5, 2026.
Just a few short weeks ago in our current timeline, that date is huge. On Tuesday, February 5, 2026, the New START treaty between the United States and Russia officially expired, and there is no successor agreement in place. Nothing was signed to replace it.
The essay details the gradual, systemic decay of this vital treaty perfectly. It had been on a fixed clock since its single 5-year extension was agreed upon in 2021. The dissolution happened in stages. In February 2023, Russia officially suspended its participation in the treaty's data exchanges.
Then, during the global disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic, the on-site physical inspections, which were the absolute backbone of nuclear verification and mutual trust, ceased entirely.
They were never meaningfully resumed. The framework simply dissolved through apathy and rising tensions.
And what that means practically is that for the first time since 1969, since the Saltai negotiations over half a century ago, there are absolutely no legally binding limits on the strategic nuclear arsenals of the United States and Russia.
The UN Secretary General called it a grave moment for humanity.
But the essay points out something even scarier than a return to the Cold War nuclear buildup. The Tufts University Center for Strategic Studies assessed this situation, and they said the real danger of New START expiring isn't just that countries will build more traditional nuclear missiles. The real danger is a qualitative arms race happening entirely in the shadows of space.
Consider the convergence of these factors. We have a massive, glaring legal loophole regarding conventional space weapons in the Outer Space Treaty. That is now combined with the total collapse of the ground-based verification architecture that used to monitor strategic deployments under New START.
You have a completely unconstrained sky at exactly the moment when putting 60 metric tons of tungsten into that sky has become cheaper than buying a small fleet of fighter jets.
So, if there are no laws stopping it, and the price is affordable for almost any developed nation, what happens to global peace? For 70 years, we haven't had World War III because of a psychological concept called mutually assured destruction, or MAD.
The logic is dark, but beautifully simple. I won't launch my missiles at you because even if my first strike destroys your cities, your hidden submarines and your deep mountain bunkers will survive long enough to shoot back and destroy my cities. The entire peace of the modern world relies entirely on the guarantee of the second strike surviving.
The entire nuclear posture, the trillions of dollars spent by every nuclear-armed state, is organized around preserving that second strike capability. Command authority must survive a first attack to order the retaliation. This is why enormous investments have been made into subterranean architecture over the decades.
The essay details several of these iconic facilities. NORAD's primary command facility is tunneled thousands of feet into the solid granite of Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, resting on massive springs to absorb shockwaves.
Site R at Raven Rock in Pennsylvania is buried under hundreds of feet of stone. Mount Weather in Virginia serves as an unreachable relocation site for civilian leadership.
Russia completed what it described as an absolutely secure, high-margin strategic control facility in late 2020. And China has constructed what intelligence agencies call the underground Great Wall, a massive, hardened network of tunnels estimated to be over 3,000 miles long, designed to hide and move mobile ICBM launchers.
All of those legendary bunkers, those feats of engineering, were built to survive a nuclear blast. But remember the physics we talked about earlier. A nuclear blast pushes out. A tungsten rod pushes down.
If a kinetic rod can flow through that solid granite, liquefying it all the way down to the command center, it changes the entire math of deterrence, because it means a decapitation strike is suddenly, terrifyingly possible.
A decapitation strike is a preemptive attack aimed at instantly eliminating a nation's political and military leadership, severing the head from the body rather than attacking their sprawling weapon silos directly. The profound terror of the rods from God is that they offer a plausible conventional pathway to execute a decapitation strike without crossing the nuclear threshold.
Because it isn't a nuclear weapon, it doesn't create the immediate, unambiguous signatures of a nuclear launch. There are no massive infrared blooms from ICBM engines for early warning satellites to catch. There are no radioactive plumes blowing across borders. There are no mushroom clouds.
A tungsten rod hitting a command bunker might not even trigger the automated radiation-sensing launch protocols designed to detect a nuclear attack and fire back automatically.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This leads perfectly into the essay's next massive point, the attribution problem. Deterrence doesn't just rely on surviving the first strike. It relies on knowing exactly who shot at you so you can shoot back at the right country.
If an ICBM launches from Siberia or North Dakota, early warning satellites see the massive fiery tail instantly. We calculate the trajectory. We know exactly where it came from. But the rod, it has zero launch signature.
Think about the mechanics of the drop from orbit. The platform is already up there, blending in silently with over 12,000 active commercial and military satellites currently in low Earth orbit. When the command is given to strike, there is no explosive launch event.
The satellite simply stops holding the rod. A tiny, almost imperceptible retrograde thruster burn is fired just to decelerate the rod enough to lower its perigee, its lowest orbital point, into the friction of the Earth's atmosphere.
This thermal signature from the thruster is orders of magnitude smaller than a ballistic missile engine. It can easily be obscured by, or mistaken for, normal satellite station-keeping maneuvers.
And because it comes in completely cold and silent through the vacuum of space, ground radar won't even catch it until it's deep in the atmosphere, glowing red-hot from friction. The math says you get about 11 seconds of warning before a 500-foot crater opens up where your most secure command bunker used to be.
Wait, we have early warning systems designed to give the president 30 minutes to respond to an ICBM. How does that shrink to 11 seconds?
An ICBM takes roughly 30 minutes to travel between continents, and its massive rocket plume is visible from the second it leaves the silo. The rod is already positioned directly above the target. The 11 seconds is merely the time it takes to traverse the final stretch of the atmosphere at Mach 10 once friction makes it visible to thermal sensors.
And here is where the strategic nightmare truly unfolds. Imagine you are a world leader. You are sitting in a secure facility, the alarm goes off. A bunker housing your top generals has just been completely annihilated. The warning time was 11 seconds. You look at your radar screens, and you have absolutely no idea who did it.
Was it the United States? Was it China? Was it Russia? It's just a rock from space.
Yeah.
Figuring out which of the thousands of satellites dropped, it could take hours or even days of back-calculating orbital trajectories.
But your retaliation window is closing right now. Your other bunkers might be 11 seconds away from destruction. What do you do? Who do you order a nuclear strike against in retaliation?
That is paralyzing. That is the strategic ambiguity that the essay argues is more dangerous than the weapon's destructive yield itself. It threatens the entire concept of deterrence through silence.
If the target is no longer survivable and the attacker cannot be immediately identified, the foundational premise of mutually assured destruction simply ceases to function. You can't have mutually assured destruction if you don't know who to destroy.
And this isn't just theoretical wargaming by academics. The military operational reality is actively shifting to address this right now. In April 2025, the U.S. Space Force released its Space Warfighting Framework. The document explicitly discusses targeting orbital strike capabilities.
And the essay notes that U.S. Space Command has testified before Congress that Russia is actively developing space-based nuclear weapons, which would directly violate that 1967 treaty, and they have even vetoed UN resolutions attempting to reaffirm those bans.
Furthermore, they've been shadowing U.S. military satellites with inspector platforms like Cosmos 2588 and Cosmos 2553. Meanwhile, China launched its 1,000th satellite in 2025, rapidly building a massive orbital architecture. The sky is getting incredibly crowded and incredibly tense.
So the natural response to a crowded, hostile sky filled with potential tungsten telephone poles is defense. I know what you're thinking as you listen to this. We have missile defense systems. We can shoot down ICBMs. Why can't we just shoot the rods down? The essay dedicates a fascinating section to proving why countermeasures are, under current and foreseeable technology, functionally impossible.
The geometric and physical problems of interception are overwhelming. Yes, ground-based mid-course defense works, but it works in space, during the predictable mid-course arc of a ballistic missile's flight outside the atmosphere.
But the rod isn't a missile.
By the time it enters the atmosphere and ground radar finally detects it, the interceptor missile has roughly 11 seconds to react. It has to launch, accelerate, and hit a slender target the size of a telephone pole, traveling straight down at Mach 10. The interceptor has to match the velocity and achieve the precise lateral displacement to cross the rod's path in mere seconds.
But let's assume a miracle. Let's assume a perfect hit. Even if an interceptor manages to strike the tungsten rod, it doesn't neutralize the threat. This is what the essay calls the shotgun effect.
This part of the reading blew my mind. What happens when you hit a Mach 10 tungsten pole with a missile?
If you fragment a 12,000 kilogram solid tungsten rod traveling at Mach 10 with a high explosive interceptor, the pieces do not magically lose their kinetic energy. They do not evaporate into the air.
You have simply converted one massive concentrated kinetic impactor into a hypersonic shotgun blast.
You now have thousands of jagged pieces of dense tungsten, each still carrying a devastating fraction of the original kinetic energy, blanketing a much wider geographical area.
You haven't made the target safer. You have made the destruction less predictable and potentially more widespread. You might actually worsen the situation by turning a single, deep penetrating military strike into a distributed surface wipeout that shreds civilian infrastructure for miles around the bunker.
Okay, so physical interceptors are out. You just make it worse. What about lasers? Directed energy weapons are always the sci-fi answer to incoming projectiles. We have naval lasers now. Why not just melt the rod before it hits?
Directed energy systems face a different, insurmountable physical barrier: atmospheric attenuation. The power requirements for a ground-based laser capable of heating a moving tungsten rod to its melting point, which, remember, is over 6,100 degrees Fahrenheit from hundreds of miles away while it is moving at Mach 10, are simply not within the practical envelope of current military technology.
And the bigger issue is the atmosphere itself. The air scatters, absorbs, and distorts the laser beam. It's like trying to shine a perfectly tight flashlight beam through a dense fog. The energy dissipates before it can deliver enough thermal shock to melt the tungsten.
Which means the only way to effectively stop a rod from God is to blow up the satellite holding it before it ever drops. Which means launching anti-satellite weapons, creating massive clouds of space debris, and escalating the arms race even faster. It's a terrifying closed loop.
But the essay introduces a horizon that is somehow even more frightening than superpowers locked in an orbital arms race. The non-state actor.
This is the logical, unavoidable extension of the cost collapse we discussed earlier. When space launch was a multi-billion-dollar endeavor, only superpowers could play. But if an entire kinetic strike platform can be launched and armed for $250 million, we are no longer exclusively talking about the budgets of massive nation-states.
For $250 million, a mid-sized corporation, a wealthy sovereign wealth fund, or a well-funded private military contractor could absolutely purchase and deploy one.
I really want you to consider the weight of that. For the price of a standard corporate merger, a mercenary group could buy an untraceable weapon of mass destruction.
And remember, the Outer Space Treaty, the one with the massive loophole. Even if the international community comes together to close that loophole tomorrow, treaties only bind nations. They bind governments. They do not bind private holding companies registered in non-signatory offshore jurisdictions.
The entire legal framework of space was built for a world where only the US and the Soviets could afford to go there. That world is dead.
And this accessibility introduces what the text describes as a profound epistemological problem. It is the ultimate dual-use dilemma. How do we know what is a weapon and what is a scientific tool? Because the exact same physics, a heavy mass moving at high velocity, can be used for legitimate planetary engineering and scientific research.
The essay brings up a perfect example of this from recent history.
Yeah.
The Hayabusa 2 mission from 2019. Japan's space agency literally shot a copper impactor into the asteroid Ryugu to create an artificial crater so their probe could analyze the pristine material underneath.
That is, by definition, orbital kinetic bombardment, but it was celebrated globally as a triumph of science.
And the scaling of that scientific principle is vital for concepts like the future terraforming of Mars. The scientific literature on planetary engineering extensively discusses thermal tapping. This involved using a kinetic penetrator, essentially a rod from God, to punch a massive hole deep into the Martian mantle to access geothermal heat for human colonies.
They also discuss atmospheric injection, where a massive kinetic strike intentionally vaporizes subsurface ice deposits, instantaneously introducing massive amounts of water vapor to thicken the Martian atmosphere.
So imagine this scenario. A private space corporation launches a massive satellite carrying a 20-foot tungsten rod. The international community gets nervous. The corporation holds a press conference and says, "Relax, this is just a seismic probe. We're testing our new Mars thermal tapping drill here on Earth before we send it to the red planet."
How do you prove they are lying? How does a UN weapons inspector differentiate between a scientific tool and a weapon of mass destruction?
You cannot. An international inspection body would find nothing to distinguish it. The mass of the object, the tungsten material, the orbital mechanics required to launch it, the nuclear power source for their release mechanism, they are absolutely identical for both applications.
The only differentiating factor is human intent. And intent is entirely invisible until the precise moment the rod is released and its trajectory is locked toward a military target instead of a barren test site. It is the ultimate dual-use technology. A weapon and a terraforming tool look exactly the same in orbit. You only know it's a weapon 11 seconds before you die.
This realization brings us to the essay's deep dive into the cultural and theological echoes of this weapon. Because while the technology is new, humanity has actually been thinking about and fearing this exact concept for thousands of years.
The essay points out that almost every major theological tradition across human history features a weapon of divine judgment that falls vertically from the sky and is completely unstoppable by any human horizontal force.
It is a remarkable synthesis of ancient myth and modern engineering. The essay looks closely at the Brahmastra from the Hindu epics, specifically the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The ancient Sanskrit texts describe the Brahmastra as the supreme weapon, a projectile of absolute last resort.
Once discharged, no counterattack or defense of any kind can stop it. When it strikes, it leaves the land barren and poisoned for eons. And crucially, the texts say it can only be countered by summoning another Brahmastra, the result of which is catastrophic mutual destruction of the world.
Which sounds exactly like the hypersonic shotgun blast we just talked about. You try to intercept it, you just make the devastation worse. The only defense is having your own, leading straight to mutually assured destruction.
It's a thousands of years old story, but it perfectly describes the physics and the strategic trap of orbital kinetic bombardment. The essay also mentions Zeus's thunderbolt in Greek mythology, Thor's hammer Mjolnir in Norse myth, and the biblical stories of Elijah calling down fire from heaven. The core idea is always the exact same. A force descends from a superior, unreachable vertical domain, and human horizontal power, our walls, our shields, our bunkers, cannot argue with it.
The text grounds this theological exploration in the very name of the essay's core geopolitical struggle. It examines the name Israel in Hebrew, deriving from the book of Genesis. Chapter 32 describes the patriarch Jacob wrestling through the long night with a divine figure at the edge of a river.
The name Israel translates to one who struggles with God. It is not a story of victory. Jacob survives, but he looks away with a dislocated hip. It is an ongoing, painful refusal to let go of a power that can profoundly injure you.
The essay brilliantly frames the 1967 Outer Space Treaty as humanity's past wrestling match at the river of the nuclear age. We held on through the terrifying night of the Cold War. But now, in 2026, the dawn of the commercial space age has arrived. The old legal framework is limping, and we are back at the river, wrestling with a new, terrifying power from above.
And to show how this recursive logic of destruction strips away all of our high-tech illusions, the essay takes us away from myth and drops us into the jungles of the Vietnam War. It introduces a physical precursor to the rods from God called the lazy dog bomb.
This thing was incredibly simple, almost insultingly so. It was just a small, solid steel slug, about 1 3/4 inches long, weighing barely half an ounce. They dropped them by the tens of thousands from airplanes flying at 3,000 feet.
There was no explosive fuse, there was no chemistry, there were no moving parts, just gravity pulling a tiny piece of steel toward the Earth. But because of its aerodynamic shape and its density, that half-ounce slug could penetrate 9 inches of solid concrete when it hit. The U.S. military deployed an estimated 250 million of them.
The lazy dog is the perfect conceptual bridge to perhaps the most famous quote regarding the future of warfare, widely attributed to Albert Einstein. I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
For decades, we have interpreted this quote purely as a grim warning about civilizational regression. The idea that a nuclear holocaust would destroy all technology and send the few miserable survivors back to the Stone Age.
But the essay argues that is only half the truth. There's a much deeper, much more terrifying interpretation. The deeper reading proposed by the author is that Einstein was accurately describing the recursive logic of warfare itself. As warfare evolves to its ultimate extreme, it actually strips away its own complexity.
It abandons delicate electronics that can be jammed. It abandons volatile rocket fuel that can explode on the pad. It abandons complex explosive chemistry that has physical limits. It returns to the absolute simplest, most undeniable equation in physics. A heavy thing moving extremely fast.
Einstein was entirely correct that warfare would eventually return to sticks and stones. He simply did not specify that the stick would be 20 feet of pure tungsten and the stone would be dropped from low Earth orbit.
It is the ultimate irony of human invention. In our quest to build a weapon complex enough to bypass stealth radar, defeat electronic jamming, and penetrate the deepest mountain bunkers, military science has literally reinvented throwing a rock. It just optimized the rock to hit with the force of 11 tons of TNT.
To summarize the profound journey this source text has taken us on today, the institutional logic born in the concrete igloos of Hastings, Nebraska, the strategy of concentrating immense destructive power in vast empty spaces where no one is looking, has officially moved to the stars.
The economic cost barrier that held this terrible idea back for 60 years has utterly collapsed thanks to commercial spaceflight. The legal loopholes in space treaties are wide open and aging poorly. And the physics, the terrifying, undeniable math of kinetic energy and Mach 10 velocity is inescapable.
The thunder isn't sleeping under the prairie grass in Nebraska anymore. It's orbiting silently above our heads, mixed in with communication satellites and weather monitors.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, chilling scenario to ponder. A scenario explicitly grounded in the text we've analyzed today. We talked about how the Outer Space Treaty only applies to nations. We talked about how unbelievably cheap this technology has become.
Imagine this. Tomorrow morning, a kinetic platform is launched on a commercial rocket. It is legally registered to a private commercial holding company, headquartered in a jurisdiction that never signed the space treaties.
If a private corporation or a shadowy mercenary group can anonymously launch an unkillable, untraceable weapon of mass destruction for the price of a mid-sized corporate merger who actually enforces global peace tomorrow morning, you're no longer waiting to see what rival nations do in the UN. You're waiting to see what the highest bidder decides to do from the silence of orbit.
It fundamentally rewrites the architecture of global authority. Deterrence is broken. The sky is no longer constrained by the state.
It's a terrifying thought, but it's the reality of the unconstrained sky we are living under right now. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking up, keep asking questions, and never stop wondering about the invisible things happening right above your head.